Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today on this panel. It's going to talk about frameworks shaping the future of rollups. So anyone who might not be familiar, a rollup framework is effectively an SDK or a way for developers to more easily build composable sub-ecosystems of rollups. A lot more nuance to that. So first I'll get started with letting our panelists introduce themselves and what rollup SDK they're building, and then we'll get started into some questions.
Hey everyone, I'm Jesse, creator of Base. Base is an Ethereum layer 2 incubated by Coinbase, aim of bringing 1 billion people on chain. Yeah, and we build on the OP stack, which I guess is the second core developer of the OP stack.
Hey everyone, is this what? Okay.
So.
Hey everyone, my name is Jem. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO of Sovereign Labs. At Sovereign, we build a Sovereign SDK, which is a seamlessly scalable and interoperable rollup framework.
Hi everyone, my name is Patrick McCory. Historically speaking, I've always been a researcher focused on blockchain scalability, and then I recently joined the Arbitrum Foundation. My job was supposed to be research and education, but I've really just focused on governance and the DAO, and trying to create a space where anyone feel like they can get involved, submit a proposal, and then run with their initiative. So yeah, sort of research and now somewhat governance, but hopefully going back to research.
Hi guys, I'm Javed. I have been in the Bitcoin space for long, but most recently I'm focused on Rollkit, which is a modular framework for creating rollups. So I'll be speaking about that today. Yeah.
Thanks, guys. So to get us started, Patrick, I'm going to start with you as a researcher of all things rollups. Curious to hear from you. How complex is it to build a rollup without a framework? And how would one even approach doing that? And what is really the need for these frameworks because of that?
Yeah, I mean, let's start off with the need first. It's always good to motivate why rollups are useful. So I just want to ask a question to the audience. So can I get everyone's attention? Whoop, whoop, whoop. Okay, raise your hand if you lost money on FTX. There we go. Did anyone lose money recently on that weird casino game, stake.com? I never heard of it before. No one? Okay, I was hoping to find one person who actually used that software. But my point there is that the whole point of a rollup is that you can take your funds, lock it into an off-chain system, transact as much as you want, bring your funds back, but never trust the operator with your funds. So it should be a technology stack that someone like FTX or Coinbase in this example, could take the technology stack, deploy it, offer a very similar experience to their users today, but in a way where it ultimately protects the user and the customer because you don't have to trust the operator with your funds. So that's the primary motivation. And then it comes down to frameworks. Building a rollup is very, 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 very difficult engineering challenge. I mean, who's been on the website L2Beats? Raise your hand if you're an L2Beat fan. Woo, I'm sure they love that. L2Beat is a website that has a risk framework that basically studies the implementation of every rollup and highlights the risk to users and how mature that rollup is. And that's because building this software is very, very, very difficult. So if you're even Coinbase as an example, or FTX, or any company that has a database that touches crypto assets, you don't really want to have to build this yourself. You want to be able to take some software off the shelf, deploy it, and then hopefully you can offer your service while, of course, protecting your users from yourself. So yeah, that's sort of maybe a long answer to the question.
That's a great answer. Does anyone else want to touch on that as well?
I can touch on the complexity of the work that is innate to building a rollup. Building a rollup is not that different from building like a blockchain. Like rollup is just another sort of like blockchain that inherits the consensus of another blockchain. And just looking at like the 2020, 2021 like bull run era of, there were like so many heavily funded alt L1 teams back in the day, and even in that era there was so many geth forks, and that like shows how hard it is to build a sustainable, like robust, like blockchain architecture. And the same goes for like the rollup stack. And as a result of that, there is definitely a need for like mature rollup frameworks for this ecosystem to work and for applications to be trusted, as Patrick said.
So, Java, do you want to say something as well? Go ahead.
Sure. So, like Patrick mentioned, having a framework will allow you to easily create new rollups. And this is what we've been focusing on at Rollkit. So we have been creating interfaces and components that can be plugged in, like they can be you can easily plug and play them. So the components are basically stuff like settlement, data availability, execution, and the interfaces define the APIs between these components. And with RollKit, you can have a modular framework where you can plug and play different components using these APIs. So yeah, the framework will make it easier for rollup developers to maintain new rollups.
Oh, I was just gonna say, it's interesting sitting on this panel because I feel like I'm the person who's been buying this offering, right? Like we spent a year and a half at Coinbase thinking about, or 2 years at Coinbase thinking about like what are the challenges, how do we want to bring our users on chain. That led to us incubating and launching Base. And I think like one of the challenges that we haven't mentioned is like, for any blockchain or really any smart contract thing, there's a component of just like lindiness or like longevity and like getting more eyeballs on these things. And so one of the things we've really thought about is like when we were going to we decided to launch an L2, I think there was a part of it that was like, oh, this is gonna be really hard, and so maybe we shouldn't start from scratch. But I think another big part of it was like, oh, if we start from scratch, we're going to be starting kind of from zero in terms of that lindiness. Like we're going to have to go and say, okay, this thing's been in production for X years before it's ready for people to put money on it. And I think we felt instead what we could do was like, hey, if we go build on an existing system, that's not only going to bring up our like lindiness timeline, like it's going to be more ready now because it's already been in production for a long period of time, but it's also going to contribute back to everyone else. And so everyone else who's building alongside us, building with us, is actually going to benefit from us building alongside them. And I think that kind of like contribution and like making it so that the work we did was like paid forward was a really big important part of it, just as much as like this was a hard problem. If it was just a hard problem, we might have gone our own way, but feeling like there was really a way for us to contribute back and do something bigger than ourselves was super critical.
Totally. And I think I want to have the audience understand a little bit better what are some of the options for rollup frameworks. So what Jesse's describing is contributing to the OP stack, which is an Ethereum-centric framework. And Ethereum-centric frameworks are pretty much, there's a few different ones. So there's Arbitrum Nitro, there's ZK Sync, ZK Stack, and so on. And the idea is to scale Ethereum. And so it's very much within the confines of how do we make L2s on Ethereum, although you are also able to customize and mix with different ecosystems as well. But on the other end of the spectrum, there's also chain agnostic frameworks, which is more so Rollkit and Sovereign. So I'd love to hear, I guess, Jesse, we can start with you again. Why did Base or why did Coinbase decide to go the Ethereum-centric route as opposed to something more chain agnostic? And what are some of the differences there between the two?
Yeah. And our process started at the beginning of 2022 when we basically kind of took on this mandate of like, how do we bring Coinbase on chain? And this is kind of what Patrick was getting at. It's like Coinbase has been a centralized kind of custodial business for the last decade, but when we think about what the future of our business is and really what the future of the world is, it's everything moving on chain into smart contracts, into these open, transparent global systems that anyone can transact on. And so we started with that intent. And at the beginning of 2022, we basically took 6 months and said, okay, we want to bring our customers on chain. Where do we want to do that? And before we even got into like roll-up frameworks or anything like that, we had to first answer the question of like, what's the developer platform, i.e. how are people going to be writing smart contracts, and how do we want to write smart contracts if we're coming on chain? And then kind of like, what's the broader ecosystem, which is kind of getting to the question you're at. And so before we even had the idea of Base, considered building an L2, we basically ran a whole process inside the company that was like, okay, let's go look at Ethereum, Cosmos, Solana, Avalanche, even like Polygon, POS ecosystem, and figure out what are the relative pros and cons, what's the technical roadmap, how do we think about this from a longevity perspective. And kind of through that work, I think where we shook out on the other side was just from a kind of like I guess across every axis, whether it's developers, total value on the chain, ecosystem adoption, like technical maturity, Ethereum felt kind of like 1 to 2 orders of magnitude ahead of pretty much any other ecosystem. And so that was really the first thing that like we anchored on. It was like, we want to build EVM, we want to build on Ethereum, and then we kind of did a secondary pursuit in the second half of the year, which was like, okay, let's really go understand Ethereum and understand understand layer 2 and understand how all of this is going to shape out and figure out how we can contribute to that. And that was really the process that said, okay, now that we've chosen Ethereum, we want to be building open source. We want to be contributing back to a public good. We want to be helping other people be more Lindy. We want to be doing this in a way that feels aligned to our values with people, who we trust and know and love working with. And I think the thing that we were really blown away by was there's so many teams in Ethereum who fit that criteria. Like, you look at the work that Optimism and OP Labs have been doing in the OP stack, it's obviously incredible, but also you look at Arbitrum, you look at Arbitrum Nitro, you look at the ZK stack from ZK Sync, you look at Polygon, like, there is a plethora of teams that are just making incredible contributions to scaling Ethereum. And so for us, it kind of felt like, like the overwhelmed with goodness. And it's kind of like, okay, now we just have to choose within all these great options. And I think we have to choose in a way that, doesn't, kind of put us on an island, but instead connects us into everyone else. And that's where we really felt like building on an open source MIT licensed framework was going to be really critical, building in a way that we could think about Base as a bridge that was much bigger than just Base, much bigger than the OP stack, much bigger than Optimism, but would actually connect into all these other layer 2s, connect into layer 1 ecosystems. And that's kind of where we landed with the OP stack.
Thanks for that. Jem, let's go over to you. And why would a developer want to pick a chain agnostic framework? What are some of the advantages to that?
Yeah. So with the ecosystem, Ethereum ecosystem aligned and like focused frameworks, I think you get a lot of advantages on being able to create these new ecosystems. Like Basis, for example, is focused on its own ecosystem. But if you're like focused on like the best single application that you can build, like the best DEX, the best like insurance protocol, then at that point, as a developer, you want to have as much as flexibility as you can have when you're developing that application. You want to be able to like change your sequencer with the system that like fits your like costs of your user the best. You might like pick a system that has like the most like security. And when you build your application in an ecosystem agnostic and in the modular, like maximally modular way possible, you get the flexibility to start writing your application right now. And as time goes on and as you learn more and more about your application, you can make the choices necessary. Like you can pick ZK like proving like later on. You can pick like optimistic proving depending on your like latency and cost needs. You can pick different DA layers depending on like which ecosystem like fits you later on down the line. And so it just gives the like developer the way more flexibility to develop that app in the way that's most attractive for its users. So for like single applications, but not for teams that are like focused on bringing an ecosystem, I think ecosystem agnostic stacks, like very flexible modular stacks, make a lot of sense.
Makes sense. Patrick, I'd love to hear also, so obviously Arbitrum Nitro is going a different route than the OP stack in terms of some of the ways that the stack is built, also in how it's going to incentivize developers to build on the stack. I'd love to hear the differences between the OP stack and Arbitrum Nitro from your perspective.
So I think instead of the differences, maybe a better way to approach it is sort of how does Arbitrum think about its license and its software and how its future plan for that. So I think the first thing to highlight is that when people use Rollups as a technology stack, how they deploy that's going to be very different. If you consider the extremes, on one end you have this custodial database where the operator controls all of your funds, straight down to the Rollup, that's the most extreme version, where you literally don't trust anyone except the blockchain and one honest party. But that is also the most expensive option possible. And in between, you're going to see like a hybrid where maybe you'll have a committee that you trust as opposed to a single party. That's like the AnyTrust, the Valadium, ZK Porter. There's a whole range of different technologies that we're all going to deploy over the years, hopefully. In the Arbitrum case, there's two processes, like there's two parallel tracks. The first one's called Orbit, which is basically a layer 3, where you can deploy your off-chain system on top of Arbitrum, and hopefully it's like a hybrid, it's sort of in the middle. It's not a hardcore rollup, but of course it's also not a custodial system. And you only have to trust one honest party to keep it safe out of a committee. Now, one of the motivations for an L3, maybe a good way to describe that is, so who's heard of the consensus layer and the execution layer on Ethereum? Raise your hand if you've heard of that before. Awesome. So I think the name execution layer for Ethereum is a misnomer, because actually what we're trying to do is take all the execution off Ethereum onto the rollups. So Ethereum's really a settlement layer, and not really an execution layer. And these rollups will eventually be the execution layer, and then you'll probably want to build on top of the rollups because execution's cheap, data is expensive, so you keep the data off-chain, but then you run your bridge and your rollup on top of this rollup, or on top of the layer 3. So right now, today, anyone can deploy an orbit chain if you want. There's a parallel track, and this is now being discussed in the Arbitrum DAO, where there's a discussion to change the license. So right now, Arbitrum is a BSL license. You have to ask us for permission, or the DAO for permission, before you can deploy an instance of Arbitrum. And that's annoying. We don't want to be a gatekeeper. Raise your hand if you like gatekeepers. No one does. Look, oh, one person did actually. Let's look away. I'm joking. But on the other end of it, the issue with a pass your MIT license is that someone can take your software, deploy it, and then compete against you and your community, and that sucks for everyone involved. So what I want to see is the middle ground, which is an ecosystem license, where you can fork the code as much as you want, as long as you give something back to the community. And so an example of this is a sequencer revenue. Maybe if you run the default configuration that guarantees, let's say, 15% of the revenue goes back to the DAO, then you're free to fork it to your heart's desire. And that's currently a line of work that we're doing now with the DAO and, of course, with the foundation, to see if we can come up with an ecosystem license that really works for anyone. And then hopefully anyone could deploy Arbitrum as a layer 2 as well, and if they want, of course, as a layer 3. But of course, there's two different paths here.
Thanks. And Javid, I'm going to go to you as well. I want to talk about what you think about incentivizing development for a chain-agnostic framework.
Yeah. So I think the framework that we are developing with Rollkit is credibly neutral. It's chain agnostic. So we want to not have any preference over the data layer or the execution layer, and leave it to the Rollup developers to choose what they think would be the best fit for them. And we are just trying to make it so that all the components are well defined and the APIs are specified, so that any new layers can be implemented using the same API without having to worry a lot about integration. This will also allow for future proofing, so any new technologies that come up can implement these APIs and be ready for integration into the framework.
And Jem, how do you think about that as well, from the sovereign's perspective?
Incentivizing developer framework adoption. I think the number one point for to be able to attract the best developers to your framework is to build initially a great product, so that in any case of open source software, building the great product is number one thing to incentivize adoption. The second thing I think is a great documentation that comes with that, so that there's nothing inhibiting for that organic flow to come in and learn more about your SDK. And the third, the main important point in my mind is, as those people come in, read and learn about your framework, they have a lot of questions, because these are bleeding edge technologies and there are a lot of sharp edges. And so having the patience, effort, and the willingness to go and talk to everyone that might want to or might not want to leverage your framework. So I think those three things are pretty critical.
One just anecdote on the base decision to build on the OP stack was, I think one of the big drivers for us, getting back to Patrick's licensing question, and it's been really cool to see Arbitrum doing that work, is we actually started building on the OP stack without talking to Optimism, without talking to OP Labs, and a big driver of that was basically that we felt oh, this thing is fully permissionless. We could just fork this if we wanted to and do whatever we want with it. And so that basically let our developers, the folks on the ground who are experimenting, just kind of go crazy and be hey, let's run this internally. Let's launch an internal test net. And they didn't have to worry about talking to our legal teams. They didn't have to worry about talking to business teams. And so I think that was actually kind of a surprisingly big driver of our initial kind of interest and decision to build on the OP stack. And I think it's a similar thing that we've seen from a lot of other folks, where just that little unlock of I don't have to go talk to a lawyer. No engineer wants to talk to a lawyer. They just want to build cool software. And especially in larger corporations like Coinbase, I think that little thing actually makes a huge difference. And there's a bunch of downstream other, I think, risks where it's oh, maybe that leads to direct competition with OP mainnet or whatever it is. But it was interesting to see the impact of that.
Yeah, I skipped that one, but I gotta say, having a free and open source license is absolutely critical for any kind of organic adoption to occur, like it did in your case.
I understand both sides because it is really difficult. Like on one hand, you want to be able to let people build whatever, but on the other hand, you want to protect something that you took so long to build. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how it all plays out, and with the sequencers added into it. Next year, maybe we can talk about it a little bit more. And I guess, okay, we're out of time, but before we end, I want to ask a question, and feel free to all answer. At the end of the day, we're building, modular systems, right? And so you can effectively mix and match most, if not all, of these stacks, or at least one day eventually you will be able to. I'm just curious to know, how do you think that your projects can be additive to each other? How can you build together to build systems that have never been built before, and how complicated or how easy might that be in the end? Javed, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So I think the biggest benefit, like you said, is being able to mix and match all the layers of the stack. So as long as the APIs are supported and the components are able to talk to each other, it's really simple to get all of them integrated. So for example, there is the project called Eclipse that is integrating Solana as the virtual machine, settling to Ethereum and writing to Celestia as the data availability layer. So they found that it's easier to integrate if they have the API that is ready for them to implement it. So I think it's just a matter of being the specifications being well defined so that implementations become easier.
I think I've got two views on it. I think what's really exciting about a field like cryptocurrencies is that you have, let's say, 10 different teams all trying to solve the same problem. And I don't want to say they're competing with each other, but the tech and the ecosystems are, this is like the battleground for the future if you assume there's going to be thousands or hundreds of thousands of this software stack. And what's cool is that you have these live deployments where we can get our hands dirty and really get a feeling for what it's like, but also experiment with different techniques and strategies on how to protect these systems and keep them secure. One could be, do you have a centralized sequencer, shared sequencer? Do you embrace MEV? Do you restrict MEV? There's a whole flavor of different solutions out there. And what's really cool is that we can deploy this into production and see what works and what doesn't work. But the other side of this is that I don't see this as a zero-sum game. I've always saw this as a positive-sum game, where by allowing people to deploy and do experiments, everyone else can learn from that and decide, okay, that's a good idea, let's incorporate it. That's a bad idea, let's not incorporate that. One example is like the the forced inclusion mechanism. How do you guarantee that if this operator goes offline, you can submit your transaction on chain, and then of course, eventually force it to be ordered and executed. Everyone's now adopted that technique, which is really cool, and it came from one of the rollup projects initially. So yeah, I've always said it's a positive sum game in terms of working together and just hopefully learning from our mistakes and incorporating the best practice, because ultimately it's about protecting people and users. As we want to make sure people can actually transact and not lose their funds to SBF.
Yeah, I think there are two very simple ways that we can share and contribute to this positive sum game. One of them is open sourcing not only your code when you're going to mainnet, but also your research and having discussions around what are the improvements that could be made to the stack. We at Sovereign Labs, as we're developing Sovereign SDK, we put a lot of efforts into making everything transparent as possible. And another part is basically as you build your components for your stack, making sure those are modular in a way that, for example, the serialization library that we've developed in-house, it could be taken and reused again in some other context that would make it other people's lives in the same stack easier. So I think putting effort into these things are good for the whole ecosystem.
Last word. Yeah, first off, just strong +1 to Patrick in terms of positive sum. We're at day -1 of the global adoption of crypto in the world coming on chain. I think there's less than 10 million people on chain on a monthly basis right now, and we got to get to billions of people on chain. And so in general, my feeling is the pie is so small and it's going to get so big. The most important thing is all of us working together to onboard as many people as humanly possible. In terms of how we can kind of work together, I think all the things that they shared are exactly right. I think think there's so much learning happening in real time, basically, from people seeing what's working, what's not working, because all of this stuff is open source, and that's really powerful. I think another one that no one's mentioned is it's just been really cool to see all of the teams contributing to Ethereum as this kind of like neutral shelling point where folks are working together to scale layer 2, scale rollups. And so, for instance, like I've been working side by side the Optimism team, side by side the ZK Sync team, side by side the Arbitrum team for like 18 months on 4844 and getting that into production, and that's going to ship sometime this year, and it's going to lower fees for Arbitrum Nitro and Base and OP Mainnet and ZK Sync Era by an order of magnitude. And so like that level of coordination that's all happening, where it's like we're all focusing in on just making it better for everyone, I think that that's really unique, and it's been a lot of fun to get to do with people.
Makes me really happy to hear. So exciting to be in this industry and talk about these things with you. So I want to thank you guys so much for joining me on this panel. And yeah, thanks so much for joining us, everyone. We'll talk to you later.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.